Just ask me how excited I am to be here. Because I'm here every Sunday with you in consciousness via live stream. And I also want to welcome those people from Unity Way Church in Vista who are tuning in this morning to be with their sister church and to be a part of this as well. I'm here in the area because I was invited to be a presenter at the Fillmore Festival at Unity Village, which was just very exciting, and I felt quite an honor to do that. And I had told them that what I wanted to do is speak about Myrtle, and that in fact I felt like Myrtle was compelling me to share her story, and I couldn't not do that. Now, it really kind of started with about 1.5 years ago. They're refurbishing an area there on the grounds called Myrtle's Grove. Beautiful trees, they now have benches there. And in that grove, they were putting large boulders. And I decided that I couldn't tithe, I could give that much for a boulder. And on the boulder, they were going to sandblast an affirmation of Myrtle's. So I'm looking through and I'm going, have you ever looked for an affirmation of Myrtle's? Have you ever read her stuff looking for an affirmation? She doesn't have very many. She writes letters with sentences like that go on and on and on and on. So as I prayed and as I read, and I asked myself too, what words encapsulate her consciousness for me? What says Myrtle? And I chose to place on that boulder, take up the words of spirit and of life. And the whole quote from which this came, in How to Let God Help You, put off then the lying tongue. Take up the words of spirit and of life. Put off the habit of thinking lying thoughts. Think of life, truth, and love as the only reality. And as I spent this year with Myrtle, studying and praying, it became very clear to me that as long as we look at Myrtle through a lens of the third dimension, the relative world, sense consciousness, we'll never understand her. Instead, we need to look through that lens of fourth dimension, or we call the absolute, kingdom of heaven consciousness, because that's where she was. That's where she was thinking. That was always her perspective. So I want to know, how'd she do what she did? Myrtle, can I follow in your footsteps too? I want to put on that mind that you have. I want to have that understanding. I want to live the way you lived. So I had to go back to 1886. We know the story. She was very ill. Doctor had said, there's nothing more we can do for you, and this is the 1880s. You have tuberculosis, and you know the family story. We get tuberculosis, we die. This is it. That's the story. So the doctors finally said, there's nothing else we can do for you. We give you about 6 months to live. Isn't it interesting how we have to sometimes hit that wall or hit rock bottom before we get it? So she and Charles went to see Dr. E.B. Weeks, and I know you can quote with me the line she heard. I don't know that Charles heard it, but what did she hear? She heard, you are a child of God, and therefore do not inherit sickness. Now that's both an affirmation and a denial. The affirmation is you are a child of God. The denial is you do not inherit sickness. Now Dr. Weeks was a student of Emma Curtis Hopkins. Emma has 12 lessons, same 12 lessons. You go to her, you go for 12 lessons, you go back, you get the same 12 lessons. The first lesson was always the nature of God. It was always about what is God. So in that, God is, she said, free health. So if God is free health, then you can't be sick. So Myrtle heard that lesson and started thinking about, what does that mean? Now, Emma is totally absolute. She doesn't do any wishy-washy stuff, no sense consciousness stuff, no lying thoughts. She's all about God is. She could have summed up her whole teachings in God is, get used to it, get over it here. This is it, live it, do it. So I did, however, go to the Revealing Word to sort of get some good words for us for what does it mean to be in the absolute or the fourth dimension, or what is divine mind. Revealing Word says that which is unconditioned, unlimited, unrestricted, and free from all limitations. We call this metaphysics, above the physical. Oh, isn't that clever? Now, the story that I heard was that Myrtle heard that, and she went up to her room, and she would spend hours each day doing affirmations and denials and reading the healing stories in the Gospels. I'm sure that she read this story many times. It's one of my favorites. And if you would be willing today, listen to it as if you were Myrtle, thinking of her history. Family says we have tuberculosis. That's it. It's done. How am I going to get through this? From Gospel of Matthew. When he entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, appealing to him and saying, "Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed and in terrible distress." And he said to him, "I will come and cure him." The centurion answered, "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only speak the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my slave, 'Do this,' and the slave does it." When Jesus heard him, he was amazed, and to those who followed him, "Truly I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found such faith." And to the centurion, Jesus said, "Go, let it be done for you according to your faith." And the servant was healed in that hour. He spoke the word. What's the word? I'm sure Myrtle must have asked that question. What's the word? What does that have to be that I hear that word? So in this story, we have about faith. We have about authority, the authority to speak the word. I hate to interrupt it like this, but Chris, do you have a handheld mic or something else that we might try? Or I'll just hold it like this. Okay, I'll just hold it. To speak the word is to speak from the absolute knowing of the absolute, of kingdom of heaven consciousness, of one with God, and knowing that we have the authority, our divine self, to speak the word of healing and wholeness. Also, I think it's interesting in this story, it's an absent healing. Jesus never went to the centurion's house. So why would that be important to Myrtle? Think about silent unity. When Charles and Myrtle realized, you don't have to be in the room praying with us. We can pray for you right here, and our prayers will be effective for you. And in fact, you can join with us in prayer and be with us in consciousness. So I'm thinking, okay, there's got to be more of this story. I want to know how did she do this? And how did it really become who she was? Because I just heard the story of she went up into a room, she did the affirmations and denials, prayed some, and voila, in 2 years she's healed. She studied. That next year, she and Charles studied with Joseph Adams, who was a student of Mary Baker Eddy, Christian Science. So they were learning Christian Science, they were studying it, they were working with it. And in fact, at the end of that study, he gave them a certificate that said they had completed the study. Some sources say he actually said, "You're now a practitioner." Now, she chose not to work with a practitioner because she said, I want to know this, and I want to demonstrate it in my own life. Otherwise, it's not my truth. And then Emma Curtis Hopkins came to town, and they studied with her 12 lessons. So one of the things she learned is that there is no permanence to effects. Effects like illness. You're a child of God. You do not inherit sickness. That's not permanent. That can be changed. So she realized that if she was changing her mind and changing her thoughts, and remember how she apologized to her body? She went through her body to every organ and apologized to it. She was shifting the energy that she had around that organ and its functioning. So she was no longer holding what she would call lying thoughts of her torpid liver, we don't use that word much anymore, and her intestinal tract and her stomach and her lungs. She apologized and changed her thoughts at a very deep level. She called them the lying thought. She spoke the word of truth to her body. Now she said, and this was in a letter that she wrote, "I consider this the secret of my success and healing, the spiritual revelation that God is actually our Father, the source of our life and the substance of our bodies." And she went on to say, and that whatever He has created, He can restore. Effects are not permanent. Our situation is not permanent. She got it. She woke up, she got it. She studied, she practiced, she got metaphysics, and she worked it. And realized that we don't speak an affirmation to make it true, we speak it because it is true. And probably everybody listening to me today is going, well, duh, we know that, you guys have been teaching it. But I can't tell you how long it took me to figure that out in Unity. Finally, it dawned on me, wait a minute, this is not a magic incantation. This is not, if I repeat it so many times in a certain position, it will do something magic to me. Actually, this is working from the inside out. And I think maybe she would have said, we're getting rid of the lying thoughts and replacing those thoughts with truth. And as you do that, you know how we say in Unity, thoughts held in mind, what's the rest of it, folks? Produce after their kind. That it definitely brings a change. Of course, we know that at some point Charles realized that there was a change in her. Now, he was studying along with her, and some of my folks listening in will know how often I've said I always had this picture in my head, because remember they gave her 6 months to live? I always figured that at 6 months and one day, Charles came in and said, "Myrtle, you're not dead." To which point she would have said, "You know what, Charles? This stuff works. This works. I'm proving it, I'm demonstrating it, and I'm going to keep going." Now, she acknowledged that she had to keep disciplining herself. It wasn't a magic, it happened all at once. She had to keep working on it. And reminded herself that Jesus would say, "Go and sin no more," which is like, go and stop thinking those stupid thoughts. Think the thoughts of truth and of life. And when you think those thoughts, there is a change. So then I was asking, what else did she do? Okay, she studied. I take classes. I tune in many Wednesdays, not always, but many Wednesday nights with class. I read, I study. Okay, so what else? What else was going on for her? Well, she had a spiritual practice. She not only did her affirmations and denials and sitting in the silence, but she also had a practice that we all know very well, and that's the 6-day prayer practice, or 6-day prayer treatment. And I know you know it because one of the years that we did a Lenten study with you, it was in that book. And so we introduced it in Vista, and I understand they're still using it. They still keep printing it up, and they still keep disappearing off the table. Now, some of my folks, they weren't real happy and excited, excuse me, as you're listening and you're hearing me tattletale on you. They'd say, "Oh, Reverend Pam, the language, it's so old-fashioned." Yeah, it is. It's from the 1880s, and much of it's from Emma Curtis Hopkins. Well, we want to change it. And I say, "Well, I don't mess with it, man. I don't mess with Emma's consciousness. I want her consciousness." But what really upset people is the line in there where it says, talks about releasing lustful passions and sensuous thoughts or sensuous feelings. Oh, I can't do that. Yeah, you can. Yeah, you can. It's talking about stuff in the physical. What do you lust after? I can do the easy things like chocolate, a new piece of clothing. Do you lust after a particular car? Or can we get a little more serious in our discussion and say, do you lust after alcohol, or drugs, or gambling? I've noticed some people are addicted to drama in their relationships. Do you have a few friends like that? Well, they must be addicted to it. They must lust after that because they keep it going in their lives, and they keep the lying thoughts perpetuating. What I love about the 6-day prayer practice is that, well, first of all, we start with the invocation. I am now in the presence of pure being and immersed in the Holy Spirit of life, love, and wisdom. I acknowledge thy presence and power, O blessed Spirit, in thy divine wisdom. Now erase my mortal limitations, and from thy pure substance of love, bring into manifestation my world according to thy perfect law. And depending on where I am and how I'm feeling, sometimes I'll say, and bring into manifestation my body, my relationships, my finances, according to thy perfect law. So I'm acknowledging that presence within me and recognizing that maybe I'm not always making the best decisions and holding the best thoughts. Each day, there's a denial. There's statements of denial and there's statements of affirmation. Think of the denials as third dimension, sense consciousness. Think of those as the things that you're going to say that you're going to release. And I brought the one for Friday today. Again, be Myrtle doing this. I deny that I've inherited the consequences of fear from my ancestors, or that the race can constrain me to accept its fears. The fears of those with whom I associate can no longer hold me in sickness, or in want, and my own understanding is now fully rid of these illusions. There is not and cannot hereafter be any fear in or about my bold world. So once a week she's saying that, and she is releasing any idea she has of fear about the tuberculosis or not having enough money, any of the fears that she got from her family or her friends or the people she's hanging out with. She's releasing them. She doesn't want those in her life, and I don't either. Some people say, I hate to do denials. Well, my favorite 12 power these days is renunciation. I want to get the junk out. So then the affirmation, think of it as being from the absolute of the fourth dimension. This is God. And instead, what we want is, I am brave and bold with the knowledge that I am spirit, and therefore not subject to any opposing power. Plenty and prosperity are mine by inheritance from God, and by my steady, persistent word, I now bring them into manifestation. She was speaking the word to herself of health and wholeness and abundance every day, and with this one, once a week. When my folks would say, I don't like the language, I'd say, get over it. There's such good consciousness in these words. Just be in the consciousness in which it was created. Now, in 1923, and this I've been waiting months to say this. In 1923, in this very room, Charles Fillmore, addressing the very first Unity Healing Conference, said that this practice had been used by Silent Unity for 35 years. All the workers in Silent Unity, which would have included Charles and Myrtle. And he believed that this is what created and sustained the healing consciousness of Silent Unity. Okay, I sat up and took notice. Ooh, get a chill. So Myrtle says, put off the lying thoughts. What are they? I'm sick. I don't have enough money. I'll never be good enough. It'll never work for me. Well, the economy is bad and it will affect me. Well, the housing market just crashed, a number of years ago. It's all over for me. There's lots more subtle lying thoughts that maybe have come to your mind right now, things that you realize you're kind of repeating to yourself. They're not really the thoughts that you want to be holding. That you want to be holding that thought of wholeness and abundance, and that you know that you're absolutely being supported. The universe right now is supporting you in everything that you're thinking and doing and saying. Those are the true thoughts she was speaking of. Now, Myrtle she also studied 12 powers. I think we think of that just being Charles and Cora. It's just Charles and Cora. No, it's not. She and Charles would sit in meditation every day, and much of the information, the realization, the aha of the 12 powers came to them when they were sitting in the silence and they were together. In a letter to Helen Glass, she said, "We have found that there are 12 central or basic centers of consciousness, which are the result of the soul's use of the God qualities of life and love, and wisdom and power and substance." When she wrote that, and every time I found a reference in a letter, I had the impression that Myrtle assumed that they had been reading the literature and the newsletters, and that they had a basic understanding of the 12 powers. Because I didn't find a letter where she laid it out and said, let me start from the beginning. I think she assumed that if they were a Unity student, they had this understanding. And she was just reinforcing and reminding them, or if they were totally new to it, she was dropping that hint of, by the way, you might want to pay attention to this. And I think sometimes you look at the 12 powers and we say, oh, everything's in our head. That's a head trip. Oh, I read that. I get it. But there's a difference between reading about it and living it, and having it be a part of your everyday practice, realizing that those are the qualities that are the Christ qualities in us. And Charles had said that all of these powers together really constitute our Christ consciousness. And we know that it's not just that we have them lurking out there somewhere, it's how are we using them. And frankly, I've become rather attached to some of Emma's material. I don't know that Myrtle did this, but I find that when I'm working with the 12 powers now, I will say, I am faith. Not I have it, but I am, because I am the Christ. I may not be fully realized, but I am faith. And with whatever's going on in my life, I'll say, I am faith, and I'll remind myself of that thing going on in my life, I'm faith. As I say, renunciation is my favorite these days. I am renunciation. And I will let go of all my lying thoughts about resentment and anger and forgiveness and fear, anxiety, and I will just, whatever comes up for me, I will release that. I will just let that go. One of my favorite days of the 6-day practice lists the avarice, greed, goes on and on and on about all these things. And some people go, oh, I just don't like those words. And I'll say, well, if one of those words tweaks you, it's probably for a reason. It's probably something you need to take a look at. And so I do when I do them. And then I think, and how did Myrtle hear this? And what was she thinking about this? And what was coming up for her? Because eventually, as Unity grew, she was working with people. And with people come personalities. And with people come their issues and their lying thoughts. And yet, what we know of Myrtle is somehow she was able to stay steady and calm through whatever was going on around her. She was centered, and she recentered. So she didn't just hear about it, and she didn't just study about it. She lived it, and she said, while understanding truth principles was important, practicing them was essential. Our spiritual ministry is only half done, she contended, unless we give those unto whom we minister an explanation of the Christ principles that will enable them to demonstrate spiritual laws for themselves. Myrtle was a teacher. I feel like once you're a teacher, you're always a teacher. It's not something you put on and take off. She really believed that, yes, she could write a letter to somebody and say, oh, you're whole and you're well and everything's good. But if she didn't teach them a spiritual principle behind it, they would just continue on in the way they had that brought on the problem. Just like when Jesus says, go and sin no more. Do it differently. Change your thoughts, change your activities, change the way you're showing up. So she would say, I love you and I bless you and I see you whole, and God is free health. God is wholeness. She practiced it, she lived it. We often think that Myrtle was the quiet one, except for prayer. And again, I can just picture in this room up on that platform, Charles and Myrtle on a Sunday morning. And apparently Charles could go on and on and on. We have the story about her, she'll tug on his coattails if she thought he was going on too long or if she didn't like his joke or his story. But I also found that when she gave the Sunday talk or the lecture, that there were times then he would get up. She was supposed to start it, and then he would get up and he'd say, well, I guess I'll just add a few concluding remarks. So she must have been a pretty good speaker with a lot to say. She was speaking the word. She was speaking the word. And in order to get up and do a Sunday lesson or teach Sunday school, you have to know what you're talking about. So that means you had to process it. She probably lived it. And what unity ministers know is that whatever your topic is for Sunday, you can expect to live it that whole week. And it will be alive for you on Sunday morning because you just got to experience it. So we choose our topics carefully. How many Sundays do I want to talk about forgiveness? Knowing that I'm going to get to experience it the whole week. And we know, and I think the most important thing she did in speaking the word, she wrote letters. She wrote thousands of letters. So this morning, I stuck a couple minutes and I went upstairs to the 3rd floor to just sit in Myrtle's office for a minute. Just to kind of be there and say, thank you, my dear friend, for being here. Thank you for allowing me to sit in your consciousness in this room where you wrote thousands and thousands of letters. Now, if you were going to write a letter to her right now, think about what it might say. Because I have this idea that she got a lot of letters that were like, Dear Myrtle, pray for me because I'm sick, I've had a diagnosis of, or my loved one, or my child, and my husband can't get a job, and it would be a whole litany of all the problems. She could have sat there and said, you know what, you are absolutely right. That's a death sentence. You better do everything you can do on your bucket list because you only got 6 months. Yeah, your husband's not going to get a job. He doesn't sound like he's very qualified, and the job market is pretty bad, so sorry about that. But, let me just pray for you to kind of get through this, and it'll be okay. Do we have any letters like that? No. In fact, it wouldn't even occur to you that she would have written that. But what I realized is every time she received a letter like that, and she was reading that, she had to refocus and shift her thoughts to be able to write back to them and speak that word of wholeness. So all day, every day, she's refocusing, because she was a loving, compassionate person. And when you are talking to a friend who's having a problem, don't you sort of get right there with them and want to hug them? And sometimes I find myself, I said, don't tell me all the details, because you're a good storyteller, and then I'll buy into it and I'll believe it. And then it's harder for me to shift into that space of knowing the truth. So I give her credit for every day shifting to speak the word of truth. Her typical letters included an outline of truth principles, including the nature of the divine, the importance of right thought, the need to discipline the mind, the use of affirmations, the elements of spiritual healing, the power of prayer, and the importance of a cleansing and eliminative diet. That's what her letters contained. So every day she was reinforcing it, reinforcing it, reinforcing it. She did not have the luxury of thinking the lying thoughts. She had to refocus to be there for others. Now in 1928, just 3 years before she died, she acknowledged she had not yet learned how to gain permanent access to the Christ consciousness. So what did Myrtle know that we want to know? Well, she knew that we're one with God, every single one of us. Whatever God is and has is ours. We don't have to beg or beseech for that. It's there, it's ours, it's a given. And she thought only those thoughts and spoke only those words. She understood that through the practice of the silence, we could experience the presence of God, our own divine selves. She understood the healing power of the 12 powers, and that this idea is not just another interesting theory, but when understood and applied, could manifest real healing. So I had to ask myself, what does it mean to speak the word? It means to speak only the truth of God, the absolute truth of God, and therefore about ourselves, and our thoughts, and our words, and our actions. It's to know that God, the principles of good, rule our affairs, and that we recognize no other law or principle. So that's why out of all the words that Myrtle said, I chose the words, take up the words of spirit and of life. I went out to Myrtle's Grove this morning, and I sat there and I reminded myself, take up the words of spirit and of life. It was a year ago that I went into that grove, not yet complete, and I had a question heavy on my mind. Is it time for me to retire? Is it time for me to leave the spiritual community that I really love, a job that I thoroughly enjoy? Is it time for me to go? And I wanted to know what words could I put on a rock out there that could help somebody, if they go out there, to focus away from the question, away from the challenge, away from the problem, and get back centered into that God place, and to really listen to their own divine inner wisdom. And so today when I went out there and I thanked Myrtle, because my guidance was to leave the church, to retire. I'm making that adjustment now. And I trust in God that the next step will be revealed, because I'm not allowing myself lying thoughts. And I trust that the next step will be revealed exactly what it needs to be, exactly the way it should be. So their teacher was Emma Curtis Hopkins, and Emma's favorite scripture was from Paul's letter to the Philippians, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. So I'm going to be a little, maybe sacrilegious, but I think we all understand. I'm going to suggest that we put on the same mind that was in Myrtle Fillmore. The mind that day by day by day lived these truths, that understood them and practiced them and lived them. That we have the same faith in principle that she had, that we learn to leave effects alone, and we strive to live the very best we can from that consciousness and that knowing.